Everyone. Today we are going to be talking about the Declaration of Independence. Today's essential questions are: what was the significance of Thomas Paine's essay Common Sense? And then explain Thomas Jefferson's influences on the Declaration of Independence. So first we're going to start with talking about specifically what would be known as the pamphlet as Common Sense. Common Sense was a 47-page pamphlet written by the revolutionary Thomas Paine, and this was published in January of 1776, half a year basically before what would be before the Declaration of Independence was signed. Common Sense had a huge influence on what would be the Declaration of Independence. Many of the same points and in Common Sense argued some of the same things that even the Declaration was arguing a few months later. But Thomas Paine argued that we should urge our separation from what would be Great Britain. He also argued that citizens, not monarchies, so such as King George III, should make laws. And he also obviously, argued for economic freedom, and that was a big part of the fact that, it's not talked about as much, especially within what would be the revolution, but this idea of economic freedom was huge. And then he obviously cried out against what would be tyranny and the abuse of what would be power by British Parliament, King George III. This was a very popular what would be pamphlet book that was published throughout what would be the colonies. It obviously, it reached a wide audience, selling over 500,000 copies within its time. And it made Thomas Paine, basically like a colonial celebrity in some ways. And obviously, it had a huge influence on what would be the Declaration itself. So, Thomas Paine obviously led many individuals to, think about independence, to support independence. Throughout what would be, throughout what would be the half of the year of 1776, many people started to really change their thinking on what would be the independence movement and really the idea of breaking away from Great Britain. The Second Continental Congress, who was the acting government at the time of for what would be the colonists, started a debate on whether that the colonies should declare independence from what would be Great Britain. And many, individuals agreed with what Thomas Paine wrote in what would be Common Sense. But, from January, through what would be June and July, there was still a massive debate on whether we should break away from Great Britain. There was a lot of individuals that, especially within the Second Continental Congress, that still were fearful of us breaking away from Great Britain. But by the time June comes around in 1776, majority of the Second Continental Congress is on board to break away from what would be Great Britain. So the author of the Declaration of Independence, guys, was a man named Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson was a delegate from what would be Virginia, fairly young man, one of the youngest within what would be the Second Continental Congress, but he was tasked by what would be the Congress to write what would be the Declaration itself. He was the main author, but he had many contributors to what would be this document. Some of those contributors are some of our founding fathers: John Adams from Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman from Connecticut, Robert Livingston from what would be New York, And it took Jefferson about 2 weeks. He wrote it in Philadelphia, and he, obviously had help. Some of the ideas that um, he wrote, within the Declaration were some ideas from what would be the four other contributors to what would be the document itself. But he is considered the main author of what would be this important document. Some of Jefferson's influences, this is something that you guys learned last year within civics, specifically, John Locke and his ideas of what would be natural rights, this idea of life, liberty, and property, and the fact that, people, citizens of a country can overthrow an unjust government. The ideas of what would be the Enlightenment era, this emphasized what would be reason, individual rights, the questioning of what would be authority, so that could be considered what would be a monarchy. And then also his own state's Bill of Rights, which was known as the Virginia Declaration of Rights. This was written by a man named George Mason. George Mason will come up again during the Constitution. But some of the ideas of what would be individual rights, consent of the governed, these were all, major themes of what would be the Declaration of Independence, but also, what influenced Jefferson to with this document. The agreement itself, after the document was finished within 2 weeks by Thomas Jefferson, the document was debated on July 2nd, 1776. The Second Continental Congress and majority of its delegates met in Philadelphia, and 12 out of the 13 colonies voted in favor of a motion for what would be independence. Within that 12 out of the 13, there was still some debating, within that two-day period of revising the document. And eventually, the document that we know today was agreed upon on July 4th, 1776. However, not every delegate was actually there at during, the the revising and debating of what would be the document itself. Some of the delegates were back in their own, colonies. So eventually, most of the delegates signed what would be the document itself on August 2nd, 1776. So it's obviously a big misconception that that this document itself was signed on July 4th, and most delegates signed it on July 2nd. So here is obviously a portrait, and you guys most probably have seen this portrait before of the signing of what would be the Declaration of Independence. This big portrait actually hangs in what would be the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. However, this picture did not happen. This shows every single delegate present on July 4th, 1776 to actually sign the document. But this never happened. A lot of times, a lot of these portraits that you guys see are fabrications of certain what would be events, but the delegates of what would be the convention itself, like I said before, most of them signed it on August 2nd. So some of the signers of what would be the Declaration of Independence, there was 56 men that signed the document itself. Obviously, a few individuals refused to sign the document based off of what would be moral reasons. A lot of some of these individuals that did not sign the document were Quakers, and it was against their morals to sign off on something that basically legitimized what would be war. And a lot of Quakers were pacifists and they did not believe in war. So a lot of the individuals that you see up there specifically were, a lot of them were Quakers from mainly Pennsylvania. The oldest signer was Benjamin Franklin. He was 70 years old. He was the delegate from what would be Pennsylvania, probably the most famous delegate at the time. Um, and the youngest signer was a man named Edward Rutledge, who was 26 years old, and he was a delegate from what would be South Carolina. And then obviously the most famous signature from what would be the document itself was John Hancock. A very unique signature, as you can see on that photo right there. But specifically, he was the president of the Second Continental Congress, former leader of the Sons of Liberty, along with Samuel Adams and Paul Revere. He was a smuggler during the times of what would be the Tea Act and the Sugar Act and such like that. That's how he made a lot of his money. But John Hancock, there's a bit old wise tale that said his signature was the biggest was because he wanted King George to see it. A lot of people do think that the reason why his signature was prominently in the middle and was the biggest was because he was technically the president of the Second Continental Congress. So you can go with either story, but I'd kind of like to share with you guys kind of some other stories that kind of go along with this as well too. So the Declaration of Independence today, you don't have to write this obviously, but it's exhibited at the National Archives in Washington D.C. There's a few copies that are left, that still exist throughout what will be the United States and the world. But the main copy itself was exhibited in Washington D.C. Same place as what would be the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and some of the other important documents that we obviously have. The problem is the one that specifically is at the National Archives is extremely faded. There is going to be a point when the ink itself will probably completely fade off the actual page, and it'll just be a blank page. The reason why that is because of things of how it was kept over the years, and especially when it comes to extreme heat, ink usually fades over time. So it's unfortunate. I believe on the next slide that I have, I'll show you guys what the document actually looks like. And yes, that is Nicolas Cage, in this picture right here in the movie National Treasure. So here is once again an example of the Declaration at the National Archives. As you can see, you can barely see any of what would be the signatures on it. You can barely see what would be John Hancock's right in the middle there. And some of the document itself is completely faded with time. So it's pretty unfortunate, but it's still shown at what would be the National Archives in Washington, D.C. All right, guys. So make sure you guys finish up your guys' notes. Make sure you guys highlight key information. Make sure you guys have 3 left-side questions. Make sure you guys complete your summary, answering what would be the essential questions that you guys have on the first on the title slide. And please make sure, guys, that these notes are turned in by tomorrow when you guys walk into class. Thank you.